I have been anticipating this day to come since a few years back where Apple makes its own chips for its MacBooks, and finally it is right here. This is the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1, which I actually ordered a month ago because I customized this to have 16 gigs of memory and a terabyte of storage. A lot of reviewers have actually praised its efficiency and power, and I've been into this MacBook Pro for about 3 weeks already. So here's my thoughts about it and why you should definitely consider buying the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1. The MacBook Pro's hardware design is essentially the same as the Intel model, apart from the fact that it only has 2 USB-C ports with Thunderbolt 4 support versus 4 USB-C ports on the Intel model. Personally, the lack of additional USB-C ports hasn't bothered me as I use mostly wireless peripherals, and my external storage devices use USB-C. I also don't use a multiple display setup, and the most I did was to extend my screen to my Philips 346B1C ultrawide monitor, which has a USB-C input that also charges the MacBook at 90 watts. Not to forget to mention, it has a KVM switch feature that allows the MacBook to access peripherals connected to the monitor. Anyway, the reason why I picked the MacBook Pro over the MacBook Air, which uses the same M1 chip, was due to 2 main reasons. First, the MacBook Pro's display is slightly brighter than the Air at 500 nits, which leads to slightly better colors if you compare them side by side. Second, I still prefer if there is a cooling fan to dissipate heat if I decided to do something heavy on it, although there has only been a rare chance that the fan spins up as I was stress testing it. On a side note, I am actually a fan of the touch bar as I like that I can quickly switch between browser tabs with it and do some quick formatting on my documents. Now, let's talk about why the M1 chip makes this machine so crazy fast. We all know that the M1 is a tweaked A14 Bionic chip that's running on the iPhone 12 and iPad Air. So what makes it different from your usual Intel x86 chips is that it uses the ARM architecture and most importantly, a unified memory configuration, which means this piece of silicon houses the CPU, GPU, RAM, memory and storage controllers, which all of them are able to access each of their resources in real time. This effectively reduces the communication latency between these components, and with a 16-core neural engine, the chip learns your usage behavior and tells all these components to optimize the system's performance as needed. This is an entirely different architecture from your usual Intel x86 based laptops, as they usually depend on the motherboard chipset to access other controllers and components. To put it in layman's terms, imagine that you have 10 people as a team in the same room as opposed to having them work remotely in their respective locations. You are definitely going to get better communication response if it is the former. This is why the MacBook Pro M1 can achieve performance that often matches or exceed x86 systems. The responsiveness in launching apps can be perceived, and waking up the laptop from standby is instantaneous. While many essential apps have already been updated to run natively on the M1 chip, there are still several apps I use that runs on x64 instructions that's translated by Rosetta 2. For instance, Adobe Premiere Pro, which I was extremely surprised on how well it worked for me in most of the basic tasks. Spotify still isn't updated to support the M1 chip, but I have not encountered any issues. But probably the most impressive of all is Steam. The client runs as usual, and although there weren't many Mac-compatible games to play with, I ran Sleeping Dogs Definitive Edition with medium graphics setting at the highest resolution with very impressive frame rates, considering it runs on Rosetta 2 and Metal Graphics. Apple quotes the MacBook Pro M1 to have up to 20 hours of battery life, which by standards we usually expect somehow a 30 to 40% variance on laptops we have reviewed. But that's not the case with my experience, as I managed to get more than the quoted battery life even when I was heavily doing web browsing and writing in the particular session. The battery also barely dropped during standby, and I usually have to charge it every 3 days in a week. If not for the lack of USB-C ports and a slightly dated design, the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1 is the best MacBook Pro that Apple has ever made, and they totally nail it with the M1 chip for its insane performance and power efficiency. Although I do wish there is a 4G or 5G version of this laptop where we can connect to online using an eSIM, but I believe that is definitely in the works, and it will make it a compelling choice over Qualcomm's always connected PC and Windows on ARM laptops. So that's pretty much about my thoughts on the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1. Do let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more contents coming right up, and I will see you in our next video.